the World Economic Forum, the World Bank head, the president of the World Bank, like a WEF elitist banker essentially, says that climate change, believe it or not, climate change is a big agenda of the WEF. He says that climate change is the cause of poverty. Watch this.
A journey fueled by hope is realized by deeds. And so merely saying that I've got a new way of thinking about things or announcing policy pronouncements will not change the reality of what we face on the ground every day. What we have is an existential climate crisis. We cannot think of eradicating poverty without caring about climate. We cannot think about eradicating poverty without caring about healthcare. We cannot think about eradicating poverty without caring about food insecurity and fragility. These are, if you don't like it, tough luck. This is the reality, that we have a set of intertwined crises. And so when the World Bank changed its vision to go from eradicating poverty, important, but eradicating poverty on a livable planet, what we're doing is embracing those challenges and widening the aperture with which the bank and its people look at the challenges we have. The reality is we cannot afford another set of decades of emissions-heavy growth. That's just the reality. So since we started talking about climate for a minute, at COP28, and this tells you the kinds of things that can be done to change, the World Bank made 5 commitments. The first one is 45% of our financing would go towards climate financing by 2025, not 2050, by 2025. Because I think a sense of urgency is our only savior in this current circumstance. By the way, we were already running at about 35, so 45 is ambitious, but not crazy. It's entirely possible. More importantly, half of that would go to mitigation, emissions, but half of that would go to adaptation, because the developing world sees climate from a slightly different lens, from the effect rather than the cause. And those of us in the developing world who tend to see climate only from emissions, we are missing the opportunity of engaging the hearts and minds of people all over the world in what matters to them on the ground every day.
Yeah, so there he is saying that essentially you cannot eradicate poverty without first solving climate change, which makes absolutely zero sense whatsoever. And he goes on to say that 45% of the financing that they're going to be offering from the World Bank now is going to be towards climate change agenda. So combating climate change, 45% of their financing. It's not going to go towards feeding the poor. It isn't going to go towards development for jobs for people in the developing world. It isn't going to go towards ways to alleviate the stress that average everyday people feel when they're not able to put food on the table. That's not what it's going towards. It's instead going to go towards this climate change agenda of shifting from the carbon industry towards carbon neutral industries, towards reducing our carbon footprint, which, look, it's a good goal to have. Certainly, it's a good goal to want to clean up the environment. It's a good goal to want to halt behaviors that cause our environment to be worse. But the average person, he says, he even admits, he says the developing world sees climate from a slightly different lens than the developed world. Well, yeah, no kidding. The developed world, when somebody's sitting there with their Starbucks, sipping their latte, saying we've got to combat climate change and we have to reduce our carbon footprint. And here I am with my reusable green bags, and I recycle and I do all of these things in order to reduce. And it's great that that happens. I mean, more power to you. But the person who's in the developing world, who's not able to feed their families, who doesn't have education for their children, who's not able to afford for medical treatments because they're so poor, they're not thinking, I'm poor because of climate change. That's not what they're thinking. That's not even in the top 10 or even in the top 20 or even the top 100 of their concerns. They're not sitting there thinking, my nation is poor because climate change causes all of these issues. They're thinking my nation's poor because the corporatists inside of these large countries come through and siphon off our resources, or they bomb the hell out of us, or they sanction us to death. It's the rest of the world being unwilling to do business with regions, causing these people to remain poor. And we saw this, for example, just in my own experience of looking at, Vietnam. My family came from Vietnam. Many of my family members are still there. And when there were the sanctions and the embargo on Vietnam, my family was poor. And as soon as it was lifted and there was economy that was allowed to flourish in Vietnam, my family's no longer poor in Vietnam. It's now the economy there is drastically shifting. And guess what? Their government didn't shift, still communist. Nothing really changed. They still have the same amount of resources. They have the same government as they had. The only thing that shifted was the world was willing to do business with them. So there was this development that happened, and they weren't sitting there thinking, we're poor because of climate change. That's why we're not able to afford food and medicine and education and roofs over our head. It's because of climate change. No, they're thinking it's because the big, bad, developed world doesn't want us developing because they want all the wealth for themselves. There's not enough to go around, apparently. They don't want to share, so they don't want to see us develop and emerge and become competitive. That is what the developing world sees. So Brazil is a big, they've spoken about this many times throughout the last couple of decades, Brazil pointing the finger at the rest of the developed world saying, you guys are holding us back. You're telling us we're not allowed to do all of the very things that you did in order to become as rich and powerful as you've become. We're not, because of climate change, right? And that's the excuse. The excuse is, well, because of climate change, you're not allowed to now develop in the same way and have rapid industrialization in the same way that we did. Sorry about your luck. We were able to do it. Oops, our bad. You can't. You're going to have to remain poor. The developing world's not buying that. But here you have at the WEF, climate change being the big theme, as it's been year after year after year. And really many people are onto it, understanding that, yes, we want a clean environment. Yes, we want healthy air and water, and we don't want to be ruining things. If we are ruining, let's say, the ozone layer or the atmosphere or whatever it is, if we're ruining it, we want to try to do things to lessen that. But at the same time, it can't be done. We see that what they're really doing is they're using these, we have to combat climate in order to put measures forward to control us. That's what we see. And it's obvious. Here he is, the same. This is the World Bank head. This is his name's AJ Banja. He is going on and talking about natural gas. Now, this is one of the, and again, he's kind of sounding like, well, I'm sympathetic to the fact that these poor countries were telling them that they can't use natural gas, and we're still using natural gas. He's kind of sounding sympathetic, but at the same time doesn't say, so we can't be hypocrites and we can't tell them not to use natural gas when we are. He just says, we got to find some kind of solution. When we tell them they're not allowed to do something that we're doing in order to be rich, we got to come up with something, but there's no answers to that. There is no solution. It's just to these developing countries, they feel like it's cruel. Watch this.
And the first one is that leadership is a question of truth. And let's take the topic of natural gas. Europe lives on natural gas. America generates a great deal of natural gas as well. How can we tell the developing world that they cannot have access to natural gas as part of the transition if we live on it ourselves? And so I think there's a little bit of the issue of trust in each other. I actually believe that if you open the taps of natural gas everywhere, you won't be able to close it again. So the wrong answer is to say, let me just do what I want. The correct answer is to say, what's the right way of bridging this situation? These are hard topics. They get emotional. They get political. And as someone said at a lunch a little while ago, the challenge with politics is we know what we need to do. The problem in the democratic world is you probably won't get elected again if you do it.
Right. So he's saying there that, it's emotional. It's an emotional topic, telling all these poor countries they're not allowed to use natural gas when we are. So we got to figure out a way to bridge that. It just doesn't fly with the poor countries. They just find us hypocritical and they push back. And poor people push back when they see that these elites are flying to Davos in their private jets while screaming about climate change. Here's John Kerry comparing climate change to fighting Hitler during World War II.
These days, in a position competing against Ukraine and Gaza and emergency assistance and AIDS for Africa and 100 other things we do, to be able to plunk the money down and say, oh, yeah, we'll do that for you. So by default, we see bad decisions being made which have implications for all of us. So I was here a year ago to help WEF launch the Gaia initiative. And I'm here again today because I'm convinced that the only way we win this battle is by stepping up exponentially from where we are today and begin to treat this fight almost as if we were in a war. I hate the war analogies because we get tired of them and they're probably overused, but unfortunately it's apt. In World War II, when we needed to gain control over the skies of the ocean and learn how to penetrate Hitler's defenses in order to win the battle of freedom, it was mid-level techs who made a lot of decisions that actually helped us win the war. And Paul Kennedy at Yale has written a book about this called The Engineers of Victory, which if you want to read about real effort, it'll tell you about it. At the end of the war, we could turn out one B-24 bomber every hour, on the hour, in a reconstituted automobile factory because we were serious. Could we be doing that today for solar panels? Could we be doing that today for blades, for turbines? You bet we could. But the politics of the world haven't yet moved to understand that that is almost literally where we need to be. Why? Because, as David just said to you, trillions of dollars are needed. Somewhere between 2.5 to 3 trillion and 4.5 to 5 trillion dollars a year, every year for the next, until we get to 2050, next 30 years. Think about that.
So trillions of dollars are needed to fight climate change. So they're going to be funneling, what they're advocating for is to funnel trillions of dollars into private sector businesses that are, the businesses that they've deemed are the ones going green. And of course, then they do things like shun Elon Musk and Tesla. And, oh, but not you. We're not talking about you. We mean other places, other companies. So they pick and choose their winners. They pick and choose their losers. But they're saying that they're going to spend trillions of dollars on fighting climate change. Again, not trillions of dollars on helping the developing world, not trillions of dollars on putting food on the table for people who are in desperate need. They want trillions of dollars to fight climate change like it's World War II against Hitler, is what John Kerry just said. Now, it gets even crazier at the WEF. Again, climate change is their big focus. It has been for a really long time. But listen to this speaker. They've asked this woman to speak at the WEF. This is Jojo Mehta. She is the co-founder and spokesperson for Stop Ecocide International. Now, what is Ecocide? She's going to explain it to you. She wants you, me, businesses, and countries to face the International Criminal Court if we are found to be committing ecocide. Watch this.
Ecocide as a word is becoming better known around the world, and the concept is generally mass damage and destruction of nature. But legally speaking, what our organisation and other collaborators aim to do is to have this recognised legally as a serious crime. Because one of the issues that sort of pervades all of this discussion is that we have a kind of cultural, very ingrained habit of not taking damage to nature as seriously as we take damage to people and property. And that, I mean, if you're campaigning for human rights, at least you know mass murder, torture, all of these things are serious crimes. But there's no equivalent in the environmental space. Unlike an international crime like genocide that involves a specific intent, with ecocide, what we see is actually what people are trying to do, what businesses are trying to do, is make money, is farm, is fish, is do all of these things that are producing energy and so on as well. But what's missing is the awareness and the conscience around the side effects, around the collateral damage that happens with that. And so putting a sort of outer boundary, a safety rail parameter in place that simply says, whatever you do, it should not create this level of severity, severe long-term and widespread harm. It actually starts to then steer decision-making and steer business projects and effectively all of those high-level decisions that actually end up with the suffering that we're seeing on the ground, have those all sort of steered in a healthier direction. So something that's not really covered by loss and damage mitigation adaptation is actually deterrence and prevention. Mm-hmm. We're all talking a little bit as though, the changes that are happening and the shocks that are happening are inevitable, but actually there are quite simple For example, with Ecocide, it's a really straightforward kind of intervention at the legal level that could actually start to steer everything in a healthier direction.
For governments as well, right?
Absolutely, for governments, for individuals, for businesses, yeah.
So ecocide is the mass destruction of nature by humans. So they're saying that this is like deforestation. Some examples are deforestation during the Vietnam War, the destruction of the environment during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, deforestation in Indonesia and the Amazon rainforest, oil pollution in the Niger Delta, and Chernobyl disaster. So all of these would be considered ecocide. Now, look, on one hand, I agree with her that you shouldn't be going and damaging the environment as an act of war. We see that there have been, there's going and torching forests during war and, polluting water systems, and all of that should be considered war crimes. But I think they already are considered war crimes by the International Criminal Court and by any sort of convention that has been adopted. So I don't know if we need an extra term for it, but the fact that they're pushing this and creating this extra term and then saying that this is going to be even against individuals, they're just ramping up. They're ramping up this, like, you're committing ecocide, and that's a trending term they're trying to get out there to make more popular. And then you would be demonized. And then because you're committing ecocide, now you're a really awful person. And we're able to then sanction you by, for example, ripping you, debanking you and cutting you off from society, ensuring that your digital passport doesn't work for where you want to go because you're an ecocide committer. So there's, the implications of this when they kind of create these new terms and then they push for these ideas, and especially at a place like the WEF where they're platforming this idea and saying, and look, like, if certainly she should be allowed to share her ideas and say what she thinks, but the fact that they're into it enough to say, yeah, let's have her speak and talk and tell everybody that people and businesses and countries should be responsible at the International Criminal Court is what she's pushing for the crime of ecocide. It's just, this is the level where they're at. Again, it's just far away from reality of normal people who are not worried as much about committing ecocide. They're just worried about how they're going to afford rent and how they're going to afford food and how they're going to afford education. These are the things that people are worried about, and medical services and stopping inflation and stopping these never-ending wars. They're not sitting there looking at ecocide, but that's what the WEF wants to push. That's Davos for you.